In the spring of 1968, a green farm equipment dealer named Vance Hooper drove out to Walt Decker's farm in Dark County, Ohio, and offered Walt $300 on trade for the 1941 vintage red row crop tractor Walt had been farming behind since 1952. Walt was 48 years old. He had been farming 240 acres of Dark County corn and soybeans since 1949. He had bought the tractor used in 1952 for $620 from a neighbor who was upgrading. He had been farming behind it for 16 years. It had been on that ground for 27 years total, since its first owner had bought it in 1941. Vance had looked the tractor over. He had looked at the hours. The meter had quit at 6,000 and had not been replaced. He had looked at the rear tires. He had looked at the sheet metal. He had looked at Walt. He had said, "Walt, I can do $300 on that machine toward the new 4020. It runs, it's got good rubber, but it's 27 years old and I can't put it on the lot for more than scrap price. Nobody's going to pay anything for a tractor that old." Walt had looked at the 4020 on Vance's trailer, green and new and representing a payment plan that Vance had laid out clearly on the deal sheet, $180 per month for 60 months at 8%. He had said, "I'll think about it." He had not thought about it for very long. He had looked at the deal sheet one more time that evening and concluded that $180 per month for 60 months against $300 for the trade, and $300 was the value Vance had assigned to his tractor. He had called Vance in the morning. He had said, "I'm going to pass on the 4020. Vance had said, "Walt, that old machine is going to need a major overhaul in the next few years. You're better off getting ahead of it." Walt had said, "I know what the machine needs. I appreciate your time, Vance." He had hung up. He had gone to the shop and done the valve adjustment he had been planning to do that spring before Vance's visit had interrupted the week. That tractor ran for 35 more years after Vance offered $300 for it. Vance had retired from the dealership in 1989. The dealership had changed ownership in 1994. The brand had changed in 2001. In 2003, the dealership that had been Vance Hooper's green farm equipment franchise had closed. The tractor was still running in 2003. It ran until the fall of 2004, when Walt's son Larry, who had been farming the ground since Walt retired in 1991, parked it after a magneto failure and concluded the farm no longer needed a third tractor. He sold it the following spring to a collector in Michigan for $2,800, nearly 10 times what Vance had offered on trade in 1968. Let me tell you about the 3 new tractors, because the 3 new tractors are the argument's proof, and they deserve the full accounting. Walt's neighbor, Raymond Holt, had taken the 4020 deal that Walt had passed on in 1968. Raymond had financed it for $180 per month for 60 months. He had traded it in 1974, when it had approximately 3,200 hours and was no longer the newest machine available. He had bought a new tractor in 1974. He had traded that one in 1981. He had bought another new tractor in 1981, which he had run through the farm crisis years on a payment plan that had required restructuring in 1984 when the payments were due and the corn price was not. 3 new tractors between 1968 and 1984. 3 payment plans. 3 trade-in cycles where the depreciation from new to trade-in value had cost Raymond the difference between purchase price and whatever the dealer allowed on the next deal, Walt had run the same tractor through 1968, 1974, 1981, and 1984. He had done 2 engine rebuilds in that period, one in 1969, one in 1979. The rebuilds had cost him approximately $600 combined. The tractor had no payment attached to it. It had no depreciation cycle. It simply ran. In the farm crisis year of 1983, Raymond Holt had been making $740 per month in combined equipment payments. The 1981 tractor, on its restructured note, and 2 pieces of implements he had bought during the expansion years. Walt had no equipment payments. His operating cost was lower than Raymond's by approximately $8,880 per year in debt service alone. At the 1983 corn price of $2.10 per bushel, $8,880 in annual equipment debt service was the equivalent of approximately 4,230 bushels of corn. On a 240-acre operation, producing approximately 140 bushels per acre, that was approximately 12% of the entire gross crop income going to equipment payments that Walt was not making. Walt had farmed through 1983 without restructuring anything. Raymond had restructured his equipment debt in the fall of 1983 and had sold his South 80 acres in 1985 to cover the shortfall. Walt had bought the South 80 acres, not from Raymond. Raymond had sold to a different buyer, but Walt had bought 80 acres of adjacent Darke County ground in 1985 at crisis prices, paying cash from the operating account that had not been drained by equipment payments. He had bought 80 acres at crisis prices in 1985 because he had the money in the account, because he had not been making equipment payments since 1952. The tractor Vance had offered $300 on trade in 1968 was, by 1985, the reason Walt could buy ground at crisis prices instead of selling ground at crisis prices. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer and tell me in the comments, has an equipment dealer ever told you your machine was worth nothing that turned out to be worth considerably more than he said? Let me tell you about the almost quit moment, because Walt had one and it happened at the wrong moment and in the wrong weather, and he has never told anyone about it except his son Larry. And Larry told me 40 years after the fact. In August of 1976, during a heat stretch that ran 17 consecutive days above 95 degrees in Darke County, the tractor's water pump had begun failing during the 3rd week of cultivating. Not catastrophically. A slow weep that became a faster weep, and then a weep that required topping up the coolant every 2 hours. Walt had been running long days in the heat, and the 2-hour coolant stops had been wearing on him. He had been in the field on a Tuesday afternoon, the temperature at 97 degrees, topping up the coolant for the 4th time that day, when he had decided he was done with the tractor. Not permanently, but in that specific moment, standing in the heat with the coolant jug in his hand, and the cultivating half finished, and the corn drying in the July heat, and the 2-hour coolant stops stretching the day toward 10 hours. He had thought, Vance was right. I should have taken the 4020 in 1968. He had driven back to the shop. He had looked up the phone number for the Darke County equipment dealer. Not Vance's franchise, a different brand, the one his cousin used. He had picked up the phone. He had set it back down without dialing. He had gone to the parts cabinet and found the water pump seal kit he had been keeping in the drawer marked for this machine for the past 3 years. He had pulled the pump. He had replaced the seal. He had put the pump back on. He had been back in the field by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 hours after he had made the decision that he was done with the tractor. He had never dialed the number. He had never told Vance or any other dealer that he had considered it. He had replaced the seal and gone back to work. He told Larry about the Tuesday afternoon in 1976, in the summer of 1991, the summer before Larry took over the farm. He had said, "There was one afternoon in 1976 where I almost called a dealer." He had told Larry about the heat and the coolant stops and the thought he had had in the field. Larry had said, "What stopped you?" Walt had said, "The seal kit was in the drawer." He had paused. "I went to the drawer for the kit before I dialed." He had paused. "Once I had the kit in my hand, calling a dealer didn't make sense anymore. This is the moment." The seal kit in the drawer had been put there 3 years earlier, in 1973, when Walt had noticed the pump beginning to seep slightly and had ordered the kit and filed it as a scheduled future repair. He had not repaired it then because the pump was still serviceable. He had repaired it in 1976 when the pump was no longer serviceable. The seal kit had been waiting in the drawer for 3 years. In the worst moment of Walt's relationship with that tractor, the worst day, the worst heat, the worst temptation to call a dealer, the seal kit had been there. He had gone to the drawer before he had dialed. The tractor ran for 28 more years after the Tuesday afternoon in 1976. Let me tell you about the collector in Michigan who bought the tractor for $2,800 in 2005, because his assessment of the tractor is the final answer to Vance Hooper's 1968 assessment. The collector was a man named Peter, who had been purchasing a vintage Dark County area tractors for a preservation organization that displayed them at summer shows in the Great Lakes region. He had heard about the tractor from Larry through the local farm network. The word that a working condition example of this particular model with documented single-family ownership since 1952 was available had reached him in the spring of 2005. Peter had come to the farm, inspected the tractor, and made his offer. He had paid $2,800, nearly 10 times Vance's 1968 trade-in offer of $300. He had told Larry something that Larry found worth keeping. He had looked at the tractor on its last day on the Dark County farm and said, "A tractor that spent its entire life on one farm is worth more than one that went through multiple owners and dealers." He had said, "The maintenance history is unbroken." He had said, "That's not common." Larry had told him the story of the 1968 offer and the rejection. Peter had said, "Whoever decided not to take the deal did the right thing." Larry had said, "My father." Peter had nodded. He had said, "Most tractors like this one end up in the dealer trade cycle, and they get neglected between the trade-ins. Nobody takes care of a tractor they're planning to trade. Your father took care of it because he planned to keep it." Peter had driven the tractor onto his trailer and taken it to Michigan. It has been at summer shows across the Great Lakes region since then. It is identified in the show program as a single-family example with documented 52-year Dark County ownership. Vance Hooper offered $300 for it in 1968. Peter paid $2,800 for it in 2005. The dealership that Vance worked from had been closed for 2 years by then. The tractor had outlasted 3 brand-new tractors on the farms around it, had kept Walt out of the equipment debt cycle that had cost Raymond Holt his South 80 acres, had contributed to Walt's purchase of 80 adjacent acres in 1985, and had sold for 10 times its 1968 trade-in value to a collector who understood what unbroken single-family maintenance meant. Not bad for a machine worth nothing as a trade. Walt had said it without drama in 1968. I'm going to pass on the 4020. He had hung up and done the valve adjustment. He had not needed to be right about everything. He had just needed to be right about that one thing. The 1941 tractor was worth more running, maintained by someone who planned to keep it, than it was as a trade-in credit toward a payment plan. He was right. The tractor went to Michigan. It had outlasted 3 of the tractors that had come through the dealer's lot in the years after Vance made the offer. It had outlasted the dealership itself. It had outlasted Vance's retirement and the franchise change and the building closure. The valve adjustment Walt did the morning after he called Vance to pass on the deal had taken 45 minutes. The decision it represented had paid out over 37 years. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Hit the bell. Tell me in the comments, has anyone ever undervalued something on your farm that turned out to be worth considerably more? The dealer said it was worth nothing as a trade. Walt kept it and maintained it and farmed behind it for 37 years. It went to Michigan for 10 times the trade-in offer and shows at summer exhibitions as a single-family example with unbroken documented ownership. Vance was wrong about the value. Walt was right about the maintenance. The maintenance is what made the value, and the value was always there. It was just waiting for someone who understood it to name it correctly. In 1968, Vance named it $300. In 2005, Peter named it $2,800. Somewhere between those two numbers, across 37 years, Walt and the tractor had been doing the work that determined which number was correct. Let me tell you about what Walt actually did in the years after he passed on the 4020 deal, because the decision to keep the tractor is only as good as the practice that followed it, and understanding the practice explains why the tractor was still running in 2004. Walt had told Vance he knew what the machine needed. He had not been speaking loosely. He kept a maintenance log and a battered composition book in the shop. Every oil change, every valve adjustment, every significant repair since 1952 when he had bought the tractor. By 1968, there were 16 years of entries. By 2004, there were 52. The log was specific. Date, hours. Since last oil changed yes or no, valve clearances recorded by cylinder, belt tensions checked, hydraulic fluid level, any unusual noise or behavior noted with the date of observation and the date of repair. The log was not a complicated document. It was the same 4 categories repeated across 52 years of entries in Walt's small, precise handwriting. After the 1968 conversation with Vance, Walt had done the valve adjustment that had been scheduled for that week and had written it in the log. He had written, Spring 1968 valve adjustment, all 4 within spec. He had written nothing about Vance's visit. He had written, in the fall of 1968, the first entry about the main bearings showing slightly elevated oil consumption on the cold start checks, the early sign that the engine was approaching the point where a rebuild would be worth doing. He had written this observation and had noted it as watch and track, not a repair, an observation to be monitored. He had watched it for a year. In the fall of 1969, when the oil consumption had increased to the point where a rebuild made more sense than continued monitoring, he had pulled the engine. The rebuild had taken him from November of 1969 through February of 1970. He had started it in March and written in the log. First start, post-rebuild, compression, even all four, no bearing noise. He had run it through the 1970 season and written the fall entry. No issues. Oil consumption, normal. Then the 1971 entry. Then the 1972. The rebuild had been good. He had watched the second set of wear indicators from 1975 onward. He had done the second rebuild in the winter of 1979 to 1980. He had started it in February of 1980. He had run it through the 1980 season and written, compression even, runs clean. He had not done a third rebuild before Larry took over in 1991. The engine was still within specification in 1991. The second rebuild had been a good one, and the subsequent maintenance had extended the service life further than Walt had expected. By 1991, the tractor had approximately 24,000 total hours across its lifetime. The engine had approximately 11,000 hours on the second rebuild. Walt had handed Larry the composition book and had said, "Read it before you run anything." He had said, "It tells you what this machine needs and when, and what it has gotten." Larry had read it. He had found the 40 years of entries useful not as a maintenance guide. He knew how to maintain equipment, but as a record of what the tractor's specific patterns were. He knew, from the entries, that the front carburetor needle ran slightly lean in cold weather and needed a quarter turn before January starts. He knew that the left rear tire picked up rocks on the north field because of the field slope and needed checking after every pass in that section. He knew that the hydraulic system ran at the lower end of its operating temperature range in November and needed 5 minutes of warm-up before working the lift. These were not things in any manual. They were in the composition book, because Walt had observed them and written them down over 40 years. The book was the tractor's biography, and it was more useful than any service manual for the specific individual machine. Let me tell you about what Vance Hooper said when he heard years later that the tractor had outlasted his dealership. In 1997, 6 years after Walt had retired and 8 years after Vance had retired, Walt and Vance had encountered each other at a high school reunion in Greenville. Both of them had graduated from the same Dark County school 2 years apart. They had spoken at the reception. Vance had asked Walt if he was still farming. Walt had said he had turned it over to Larry in 1991. Vance had asked how the operation was going. Walt had said it was going well. Vance had asked about the ground. Was it still 240 acres? Walt had said 320 now, with the 80 he had bought in 1985. Vance had said, "You bought ground in 1985? Walt had said, "Crisis prices, cash, purchase." Vance had nodded. There had been a moment of quiet. Then Vance had said, "I still remember coming out to your place in 1968 with the 4020. Walt had said, "I remember." Vance had said, "You didn't take the deal." Walt had said, "No." Vance had said, "That old machine ever give up on you?" Walt had said, "Still running." 1997, the tractor was still in the field. Vance had shaken his head. He had said, "I offered you $300 on that machine." Walt had said, "You did." Vance had said, "What would you have put on it?" Walt had thought about it. He had said, in 1968, running the way it was running, probably $1,200 to $1,500, if you were selling it to a buyer who knew what he was looking at. He had paused. "But you were looking at it as a trade-in on a payment deal, not as a machine someone would want." Vance had said, "That's a different kind of value." Walt had said, "Yes, it is." Vance had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "I spent 30 years telling farmers to upgrade." He had paused. "I wonder sometimes how many of them would have been better off doing what you did." Walt had said, "Some of them." He had looked at his drink. He had said, "Not all of them." Some machines needed replacing. He had paused. "Mine didn't in 1968. Vance had said, "How did you know?" Walt had said, "I knew what it needed, and I knew I could give it what it needed." He had paused. "That's the question. Not how old is the tractor. Can you give it what it needs to keep running?" He had said, "If you can, you keep it. If you can't, you upgrade." Vance had nodded. He had said, "I never framed it that way." Walt had said, "I know. You framed it as age and hours." He had paused. "Age and hours aren't the machine. They're just numbers. The machine is the metal underneath." Vance had not argued with this. He had said, "Your machine ran for, 35 more years after I offered you $300? Walt had said, 36. He had said, "It's still in the field." Vance had shaken his head slowly. He had said, "I should have offered you more." Walt had said, "You were offering the right price for what you could do with it." He had paused. "I was keeping it for what I could do with it." He had said, "Those are two different calculations." Vance had said, "Yes, they are." He had said nothing more about it. They had talked about other things. They had parted on good terms. Vance had died in 2002. His dealership had closed in 2003. The tractor had been running until 2004. It had outlasted him. Not by much, but it had outlasted him. And the franchise he had built and the payment plans he had written across 30 years of selling new equipment to Dark County farmers. Walt had passed on the deal in 1968 because he knew what the machine needed and knew he could give it what it needed. He had been right. The machine had been worth keeping. The machine had outlasted everything Vance had brought to the farm that day on the trailer. The maintenance is the value. The value is in the metal. The metal was worth more running than traded. Walt said, "Can you give it what it needs to keep running? If you can, you keep it." He could. He did. 36 years. The tractor went to Michigan. It is at summer shows. The log that Walt kept from 1952 to 1991 and that Larry kept from 1991 to 2004 went with it, photocopied. The original in the family filing cabinet in Dark County, Ohio, the same composition book in Walt's small, precise handwriting. $300 on trade in 1968. $2,800 to a collector in 2005. The difference is 37 years of giving it what it needed. Let me tell you what the composition book actually contains that made it useful to Larry when he took over the farm, because the book is Exhibit A in the argument that knowing a machine is worth more than owning a machine. The composition book ran from October of 1952, the month Walt bought the tractor from the retiring neighbor, to the fall of 2004 when Larry parked it and sold it to Peter. 52 years of entries. 4 columns. Date, Hours estimated. Work done? Notes. The handwriting changed once, halfway through, from Walt's small, precise script to Larry's larger, looser hand. The format did not change. Some of the entries were routine and brief. October 15th, 1958, estimated 3,200 hours. Oil change. Plugs checked. Some were more detailed. February 1970, post-rebuild first start, compression even all 4. Oil pressure 45, cold 38, warm, no bearing noise. Timing set. Some were observational. July 1976, pump seal replaced per kit from parts drawer. Now that I'm in the pump, I see the impeller vanes are worn slightly. Not failing yet. Watch. Some were consequential. Fall 1979. Bore check shows 0.028 over original on cylinders 1 and 3. Time for rebuild this winter. The observational entries are the most valuable. They are the entries that capture the specific behavior of this specific machine in this specific context. The Dark County farm, the loam soil, the particular demands of the North Field with its slope and its rock tendency. No service manual contains this information. It exists only in the composition book. Larry had found, in the entries from 1972 to 1976, a sequence of observations about the hydraulic system's behavior in cold weather that told him the system ran better if you gave it 8 to 10 minutes of warm-up at idle before working the lift in temperatures below 30 degrees. This was not in the hydraulic system service specification. Walt had learned it from the tractor's behavior and written it down. Larry had read it and applied it. The hydraulic system had not given them trouble in cold weather across Larry's entire tenure. This is what 52 years of attentive ownership and careful documentation produces, a body of knowledge about a specific machine that is worth more than the machine's scrap value, its trade-in value, or even its collector value. Peter had bought the machine for $2,800. The composition book that went with it was not appraised as a separate item. It was included in the sale because it was part of the machine's history. Its specific knowledge about the machine's behavior over 52 years was transferred to Michigan along with the metal. Peter had said, "A tractor that spent its entire life on one farm is worth more than one that went through multiple owners and dealers." What he had meant precisely was, the knowledge accumulated by one owner across a continuous relationship with one machine is worth more than the sum of the trade-in values the machine would have passed through in the dealer cycle. The knowledge is not separable from the machine because the knowledge is about this machine's specific behavior in this specific context. You cannot transfer it to the next machine. You can only accumulate it by staying with the machine long enough for it to show you what it knows. Walt had stayed with the machine for 39 years. He had written down what it showed him. Larry had read what Walt wrote and added his own 13 years of observations. The composition book that went to Michigan is the record of 52 years of one machine being known by the people who operated it. Vance had looked at age and hours. He had made the assessment that the trade-in value of a known quantity was $300. He had been correct that $300 was what the machine was worth to him. To a dealer who would need to recondition it and sell it to an unknown buyer who would not know its history and could not benefit from 52 years of accumulated knowledge. To Vance, the machine was a number. He had priced it correctly as a number. To Walt, the machine was a relationship and a knowledge base and a record of 39 years of maintenance decisions that had produced a machine in better than expected condition at every assessment point. To Walt, the machine was worth more than the number, because what he was keeping when he kept the machine was not just the metal, but the continuity of the relationship and the accumulated knowledge that the relationship had produced. Vance was right about the number. Walt was right about the value. They are not the same thing. The machine went to Michigan for $2,800 in 2005. The dealership that Vance had built was 2 years closed. The franchise had changed ownership twice and brands once in the years since Vance's retirement. The building that had housed the offer, the new machine on the trailer, the deal sheet, the $300, was doing something else with its square footage. The tractor was at a summer show in Michigan in the summer of 2005, identified as a single-family 52-year Dark County example. The show program listed the years of documented ownership. It listed the 2 engine rebuilds. It listed the maintenance history as continuous and documented. $300 in 1968, $2,800 in 2005. The composition book included. The dealer named the number. Walt proved the value. The value won. That is the whole story. Walt said, "Can you give it what it needs to keep running? If you can, you keep it." He kept it for 39 years. He gave it everything it needed in those 39 years. The machine gave him everything he needed in return. 40 planting seasons, the financial stability to buy 80 acres at crisis prices in 1985, the specific satisfaction of having been right when the dealer said he was wrong, and the particular pride of handing the composition book to his son in 1991 and saying, "Read it before you run anything." Larry read it. He ran it for 13 more years. He sold it for $2,800 and kept the photocopies. The machine is at summer shows in Michigan. The original composition book is in a filing cabinet in Michigan. The photocopies are in a filing cabinet in Dark County, Ohio. The dealer said nothing as a trade. Walt said, "Let me show you what nothing looks like after 37 years of maintenance." Subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Hit the bell. Tell me in the comments, what machine on your farm has been undervalued by everyone except the family that maintained it? Walt kept it. It outlasted 3 brand new tractors on the farms around it. It outlasted the franchise. It outlasted the man who offered $300 for it. $300 on trade in 1968. He passed on the deal and did the valve adjustment. Sometimes that is the whole story.